The morning didn't feel like victory. It felt like real life. Rice softening on the stove, tiny bowls
Thank
waiting
you
for
for taking
spoons,
care of me.
and the sound of Anna whispering
I
her
am
care
very
card aloud
grateful.
as if kindness
These
required
oranges look
rehearsal.
perfect for the fruit
James stood
salad.
at the sink,
Yes,
rinsing
and James is
fruit.
doing a great job with the
Sleeves rolled,
cranberries.
every
It's gonna
movement
be a lovely
deliberate.
breakfast.
He looked calmer than the day before, but I knew better. It was the calm of a man holding the line, ready for anything, hoping for peace. Anna held up her card. Today, I wrote, "You are safe here." My breath caught. That's a strong sentence. James leaned down and kissed her forehead. That's a healing sentence. We opened Hill Fruits like always. Light on. Gate open. Cards in the box. Notes in the jar. Life didn't pause just because our hearts still felt sore. Luan arrived with crates, joking we were turning into the most emotional fruit shop in town. But even as he smiled, his eyes flicked to the road. These such a way a good friend watches for storms. Mr. Hung came early too. No gossip, no fuss, just oranges in a bag and a quiet question. How's the cheek? I blinked, confused, until I realized he meant James's father. James heard and didn't flinch. He'll live, he said, evenly. Mr. Hung gave one nod. Good, he said. And after a pause that felt weighty, he added, and you should live too. For a few hours, the world behaved. Customers read Anna's cards. A grandmother bought extra guavas for the resort people. Someone left a note in the jar. Your light makes me feel brave. But peace has a way of summoning its opposite. Mr. Hui arrived, loud, leaning on the gatepost like the dirt road owed him rent. So, he called. Out, voice sharp. I heard Diep hit a rich man. Luan's hands stilled mid-stack. James didn't move, didn't raise a brow, just looked, calm, steady, with eyes that said, try again. Mr. Hai chuckled, delighted by the audience. They say you'll get sued. They say this place will close. They say you'll regret. People say many things. I cut in softly, still weighing fruit. Do you want oranges, Mr. Hai, or do you want attention? A woman in line let out a quiet laugh. Mr. Hai flushed. I'm just warning you. Rich men don't forgive. James stepped beside me, not in front, beside. Then it's good we're not selling forgiveness, he said gently. We're selling oranges. As if on cue, Officer Thu's motorbike slowed at the corner, visible and steady. Mr. Hai suddenly remembered he had errands. After he left, I noticed my hands were shaking, not because of him, but because the village doesn't need facts. It needs fuel. And we were firewood for someone's favorite story. I leaned close to James. What if your father changes his mind? James didn't blink. Then we hold the same boundary, he said, quietly, again. Before I could respond, my phone buzzed. Miss Trang. I stepped into the back room, pulse in my ears. Diep, she said briskly. Confirming Monday pickup. Also, an update. We received a second call. I froze. She continued, voice calm. Someone retracted the earlier concern. Confirmed your stability. Who? I whispered. A man. He identified himself as James's father. The room stilled. He apologized, Ms. Trung added. Undu said to proceed as planned. He offered to fund crate supplies. We declined. We prefer clean vendor relationships. My hand gripped the shelf beside me. Thank you for telling me. Her voice softened. Keep your pace. We'll do business with what we see. And what we see is consistent. I hung up and just stood there. No speech, no performance, just one move. Backward. James's father had lifted his hand from the chessboard, if only slightly. When I stepped back out, James caught the shift in my expression immediately. Ms. Trang? He asked. I nodded. He called. To hide, but to gather something inside. Okay, he said quietly. That's a start. Luan let out a theatrical breath. So the quiet blessing is real. Or strategic, came Officer Thu's voice from the doorway. He'd slipped in unnoticed as usual. Both can be true, he added. Good action is good action, but you still stay careful. James nodded. We will. And that's when peace cracked open for the second time. A woman stepped to the gate. Not dressed fancy, not dramatic, just a plain blouse, hands clasped tight. Her eyes searched the little shop like she didn't know if she had permission to enter. I recognized her immediately. James's mother, not from meeting her, but from the way her echo lived in the parts of James that still ached when no one was looking. James saw her and froze. For a heartbeat, he was 12, again, stuck between running forward and backing away. I stepped out first, slowly offering safety the only way I knew how. Are you looking for someone? I asked gently. Her eyes filled. James, she whispered. James moved, step by step, until he stood before her, taller now, broader but breathless. Mom, he said. She reached up with trembling fingers and touched his cheek like she was checking if he was still warm. You're here, she whispered. You're alive. I'm here, James said. And I'm sorry it took me so long. Silence swept the shop. Not a tense silence. The kind women offer each other when they sense something sacred unfolding. Mr. Hung stood near the oranges like a quiet sentinel, guarding a moment no man had the right to interrupt. Then she turned to me. Her eyes were afraid, but not empty. She had come anyway. That meant courage. I stepped forward. I'm Diep. Her voice broke. Thank you for keeping him warm. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the truest thing I knew. He keeps us warm, too. And then Nye toddled through the gate with Luan's cousin, waving her toy orange like royalty. She saw James. "Daddy!" James scooped her up, and she patted his cheeks with tiny, sticky fingers. James's mother stared in awe. "That's your baby?" James nodded. Nye, in her perfect 2-year-old timing, turned and offered her toy orange to the woman. With a proud grin, everyone laughed. Not loud, just gently, because toddlers don't understand tension, and that's why they're able to melt it. James's mother covered her mouth. Her eyes glistened. "She's beautiful." James looked at me, and I felt it. This wasn't a perfect ending. But maybe, just maybe, it was a door. Folks, my heart is pounding. Before we see the rescue, please hit subscribe to support this channel and help more stories like this reach the people who need them. We didn't close the shop early. We didn't pop open celebration tea. We simply continued. Because when peace finally knocks, you don't slam the door in joy. You open it slowly. Let it take off its shoes and see if it stays for supper. Later that afternoon, James's mother sat at the small window table with a cup of green tea. She didn't speak much, she just watched. James weighing fruit, me counting change, Nye munching banana slices like she was doing. A very important job. James's mother saw the sweep of it all. Not luxury, but a life. A small shop, a light always on, a rhythm built on care. And when it was time for her to go, James walked her to the gate. He didn't promise things he couldn't control. He didn't ask for what she might not be ready to give. He just said, "You can come again. You don't need permission." She nodded, tears tracking down her cheeks. "I want to," she said quietly. "I'm just learning how." That night, after the children were asleep, we ate dinner the way we always did. Nye had demanded more soup. Anna had read her newest card, "You are safe here," like it was part of the evening prayer. James clapped like a resort guest, which made Anna giggle so hard she nearly dropped her spoon. And then the house grew still. James laid 2 things on the table. First, the business card from his father, with the handwritten line on the back, "For the shop. No conditions." And second, a folded note. James's mother had slipped it into his hand before leaving. He didn't open it right away. He looked at me first. Today felt, like a door. I nodded. "A door can open slowly." James unfolded the paper. One simple crease, one sentence. His jaw tightened. Not with fear, not with anger, with readiness. "What is it?" I asked. He read it again before answering. She wrote, "Your father wants one last dinner, with me present." I blinked. James said, the note beside the business card. "He says he's blessing us," he murmured. "Now we see what that blessing costs." Outside, the fruit shop light still glowed, Inside, we sat shoulder to shoulder, neither smiling nor afraid. Just steady. Because sometimes peace arrives with a note, and sometimes it waits to see who shows up for supper. The invitation didn't come through channels. No. Driver, no phone call, just a time and a place, written on the back of the same card, Tuesday, 6 p.m. Our house, ours, not his, not mine. Ours. James stared at that word for a long time. Not because he believed it, but because he understood it was bait wrapped in silk. Tuesday came. We didn't dress like warriors. James wore his regular shirt. I tied my hair back the way I always do. He didn't ask me to come, but he didn't ask me to stay either. So we walked together. The house sat at the end of a paved drive, gated, manicured, the kind of home that smelled of investment portfolios and old expectations. James opened the door without knocking. His father was already seated at the dining table. His mother sat opposite, hands folded like she was anchoring herself. The table was set. 2 bowls, 2 plates, untouched food, folded napkins that looked too stiff to use. And between them sat a white envelope. James didn't speak. Neither did I. We stood there long enough to make his father shift in his chair. Finally, James said, "I thought you didn't like surprise visits." His father looked up, face unreadable. "This isn't a surprise, it's a reckoning." James arched a brow. "That's a heavy word for dinner." His mother broke the tension. "He means," she said softly, "that he's here to listen, not lecture." James didn't sit right away. He glanced toward me, then to the empty seat across from his father. Slowly, deliberately, he pulled out the chair and took his place. I stood behind him, not interfering, but near enough that he didn't feel alone. His father gestured to the envelope. "Inside is a sealed donation. To your shop, unconditional." James didn't reach for it. "Why now?" His father blinked. "Because I've seen what you built. And because your daughter gave my wife a plastic orange like it was treasure." Silence. Then James said, "You were never just absent. You were sharp." His father nodded slowly. "I was wrong and late." James exhaled. "Late is better than never, but it's still not now." His mother's voice broke slightly. "Then let this be a beginning." The man across the table looked older suddenly, not in years, in the way truth ages a man. "I won't ask you to forget," he said, "but I'd like to be allowed in." James didn't answer right away. He turned just enough to meet my eyes. Then he said, "This isn't just my door anymore." I stepped forward. Not to rescue, not to judge, just to be beside him. "You're not buying your way in," I said gently. "If you come, it's to witness, not to manage." James's father didn't flinch. "I understand." James nodded once. "Then come to the shop. Bring no speeches, just buy fruit." A pause. Then his father smiled. "Small, real. I will." We walked home in quiet. James held my hand, but his mind walked a few steps ahead. At the gate, Anna's latest card fluttered slightly in the breeze, taped to the window beside the counter. James read it out loud. "You are safe here." And for the first time in a long time, I think he believed it too. We didn't talk about his father after that. Not that night. Instead, James sliced mangoes for Anna. Nye curled up in his lap, snoring through a story she didn't finish. The kettle whistled. The lights stayed on. Ordinary peace. That's what we prayed for. And when the envelope was finally opened, the next morning, there was no check, just a printed receipt. 500 sealed crates, prepaid. 2, be delivered with no return address. And a note typed in plain font, for the children, for the light. We never spoke of it again, but from that day on, we kept one extra orange by the register, unlabeled, unsold. We called it the quiet one. And sometimes, that's the most a father can be. The day after the blessing, life continues at Hill Fruits, but tension simmers. When James's mother arrives unexpectedly, the reunion is quiet, cautious, and tender. Later, a handwritten note reveals his father's request for one last dinner with her present. At the meeting, James hears not just apologies, but an offer, an unconditional donation to the shop. He doesn't accept the words easily, but sets a boundary. If his father wishes to belong, he must witness, not control. Back at home, the family returns to routine. Cards, fruit, stories, and quiet. The next morning, they discover the donation wasn't money, but 500 prepaid crates with no return address, just a typed message. For the children, for the light. They say nothing, but leave one orange, aside by the counter, a quiet offering from a man learning how to love, late but real.